Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start. The 92nd Plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 62 entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in February, on the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the General Assembly made its will very clear. It adopted 2 resolutions. Both of them reaffirmed the Assembly's unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders extending to its territorial waters. Both of them call for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation in line with the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. Yet the war in Ukraine continues. This despite the firm and clear calls from the international community, including this esteemed General Assembly. Your Excellencies, there has been a rise in civilian casualties as well as the targeting of cities and civilian infrastructure with drones and missile strikes. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis remains serious. This is unacceptable. Since 2022, the Assembly has adopted 8 resolutions. These resolutions have consistently reaffirmed the need for a peaceful solution, one rooted in the Charter of the United Nations and in international law. I reiterate the Assembly's demand for the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine's territory and an end to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. As we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Charter, this year we must reaffirm that peace will never be achieved through force. Not at all. Peace will come through dialogue and diplomacy and through upholding the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. I welcome recent diplomatic efforts by the United States to foster dialogue and to promote a process towards lasting peace through negotiations and diplomacy. That is a great step in the interest of peace. All dialogue must be inclusive in order to build a peace that is just, comprehensive, and sustainable. It must also be firmly anchored in international law and the General Assembly resolutions. Let us prove that a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is within reach. Thank you. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Mariana Betsa, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, it's a great honor for me to speak here today in this hall. On the one hand, I feel gratitude to the UN General Assembly for supporting Ukraine throughout these 12 years of unprovoked, unjust, and barbaric Russian aggression against Ukraine. On the other hand, I cannot ignore the tragic pain and the tragic price Ukrainians do pay every single day for our freedom, for our independence, for our sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also for the freedom of the entire democratic world. Just as I was coming to New York, a little girl, Angelina, was laid to rest in Kiev. She was only 2 years old. She was born during the Russian aggression, and she was brutally murdered by Russia on August 28th, together with other 24 civilians sleeping in their homes. And yesterday, 9 people were killed in Konstantinivka, a city in Donetsk region, again following heavy artillery shelling by Russia. As we speak, Russia launched a missile attack on Chernihiv. Every single day, every single moment. And Russian goals for these 12 years hasn't changed. Russian strategy hasn't changed. To destroy Ukraine as a country, to destroy Ukraine as a nation. And there should be no illusions about this and no wishful thinking. Mr. President, since I last stood up in this hall when we adopted the UNGA resolution on just, comprehensive, lasting peace for Ukraine on 24th February this year, the security situation has sharply deteriorated. Just on 2nd and 3rd September this year, Russia launched nearly 500 drones and more than 20 missiles at Ukrainian cities. Again, yet another proof that Russia doesn't seek peace. It wants to continue the war. We deeply value the diplomatic efforts by the United States, Europe, by other nations and friends and allies and partners who support Ukraine. Ukraine remains committed to peace and diplomacy. Yet, Russia's brazenness striking our cities in broad daylight, while the leader of Russia spreads propaganda at the SCO summit in China, cannot be ignored. This war has nothing to do with so-called denazification, with NATO, or any false security concerns. This war has to do with Russia's authoritarian regime pursuing imperial ambitions and trying to erase Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian nation. And Russia cannot wage this war alone. Its aggression is sustained by drones from Iran, arms and personnel from the DPRK, in all violation of Security Council resolutions, as well as the support of the Chinese companies. Only decisive global pressure, especially on Russia's war economy, can cut off these lifelines and end Moscow's campaign of terror. Distinguished members, occupation does not end the war. It conceals suffering and prepares the ground for further assault and aggression. And Russia makes no secret of its ambitions. At a recent Defense Ministry meeting, a map behind General Gerasimov erased not only occupied areas, but also Kharkiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kherson, a clear sign of Moscow's plans. Occupation is never the end. It is always a staging ground for another assault. And wherever Russia occupies, we witness grave human rights violations in the temporarily occupied Crimea, in some parts of Donbass, tortures, enforced disappearances, grave violations of the rights of children. And they're all documented by the UN and others for the past 12 years. Thousands of Ukrainians remain in Russian captivity, tortured and starved, denied contact with their families. Russia blocks UN and RCSC access to conceal its crimes because Russia does not want the world to know the truth about its heinous crimes. Crime of aggression, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, which Russia keeps on committing on an industrial scale. The UN Secretary General's latest report confirms Russia's systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Ukrainian prosecutors have already recorded 372 cases involving men, women, and also children. We demand the immediate release of all Ukrainian civilians held in Russian torture chambers and call for substantial international pressure to ensure that Russia complies with the international humanitarian law. Mr. President, perhaps the most heartbreaking impact of this war is on our children. Since the full-scale invasion, at least 648 children have been killed and over 2,100 wounded. Millions more endure violence, displacement, disrupted education, and mental trauma. Russia has deported at least 20,000 Ukrainian children from temporarily occupied territories. In grave breach of international law, Russia erases their identity, changes their personal data. This is the largest state abduction operation in the world history. A state that abducts and kills our children cannot pretend to wave the UN flag of peace. Ukraine, therefore, calls on the UN to suspend Russia from UN peacekeeping operation. Let me say a few examples. The case of 16-year-old Viktor Azarovsky, seized in occupied Melitopol, tortured, and sent to notorious detention center. Other children, such as Oleg Shokolad and Denis Vasilika, were arrested as minors and remain in custody. Testimonies confirm that boys like Pavlo Hrimaka and Danilo Daho were killed in custody, and they were just children. This is about humanity. Not a single child should be separated from the parents. Not a single child should endure such pain. This is genocide, and therefore the International Criminal Court has issued 2 arrest warrants on Russian leader and on Maria Lvova-Belova for crimes against Ukrainian children. Accountability should follow. Ukraine is grateful to all the countries and organizations who joined the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, co-chaired by Ukraine and Canada. But we need to do more. We need to return each and every child back home. Our red lines are very clear. Children are the most vulnerable group. They are not negotiable. Ukrainian children are non-negotiable. They should be returned prior to any peace talks, unconditionally. Not a single child should endure such trauma as Ukrainian children do. Distinguished members, Russia is pursuing a deliberate policy of forced demographic change in occupied territories, deporting Ukrainians to remote Russian areas while resettling Russian citizens in their homes. In Crimea, occupied temporarily since 2014, this policy has been especially severe. The peninsula, once a vibrant hub of culture and diversity, has been turned into open-air prison. Political persecution is a daily reality. Today, 248 Ukrainian citizens, including 163 Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Crimea, languish in prisons and detention centers. Since the full-scale invasion, Russia has multiplied its political prisoners, abducting activists, human rights activists, volunteers, journalists, local officers, and former servicemen. Many have been transferred to Crimea or Russia. The fate of many is unknown. Consider one case, Apas Kurtamer, the youngest Crimean Tatar political prisoner. He just turned 21 in a maximum security colony. His only crime, in inverted commas, was lending a friend 500 hryvnias, almost $12. Russia called it terrorism financing and sentenced him to 7 years in prison. This is the daily reality of the occupation. Religious minorities, Orthodox, Greek Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Catholics face harassment, confiscation of property, and destruction of places of worship. Russia even illegally conscripts Ukrainians from occupied territories, forcing them to fight against Ukraine. Dear colleagues, Ukraine has remained very transparent throughout the war. We invited UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission and cooperate fully with UN, ICC, and different NGOs. Russia, on contrary, conceals its crimes, bans monitors, silences independent voices. Yet the evidence for these 12 years is overwhelming, and accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity by Russia is inevitable. Together with our partners, Ukraine will pursue justice for every crime. We're grateful to each and every delegation who supported the establishment of the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression against Russia. It is extremely important and landmark event. We need to bring all Russian war criminals to responsibility. Dear colleagues, for over 3 years, Russia has illegally occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest. It has turned the site into a military base and a nuclear shield for shelling, while persecuting Ukrainian staff who refuse to collaborate. The risk of catastrophe is real. Any restart of the plant's reactors is possible only after the authority of Ukraine's legitimate regulator, not under Russian occupation. The IAEA must have full, unhindered access to all areas of the plant, with monitoring rotations conducted exclusively throughout Ukraine-controlled territory. Mr. President, it is impossible to advance peace if one party, one side refuses to engage honestly. Talks with Russia will only succeed if backed by serious pressure. Otherwise, Moscow will only continue its aggression. We must abandon illusions. There must be no wishful thinking. Russia will not stop by itself. It will stop only when we as an international community do stop Russia, by common pressure, including sanction pressure on Russia, political, economic, financial. It's not to block the dialogue. It's to compel Russia, to force Russia to peace. But before that, there should be a first step, truce or ceasefire in place, unconditional, in the sky, on the land, at the sea. This is the first step that will open the door to diplomacy. Second, Ukraine needs clear security guarantees. And as we speak, the coalition of willing is taking place in Paris. And I'm grateful to the French and UK leadership in this and all the countries participating. We need binding, legally binding, robust, solid security guarantees that will be like Article 5 of NATO. We need a mission, military contingent of allied forces on the ground. Otherwise, the war will continue. Ukraine will never recognize the temporarily occupied territories as Russian. Crimea, like all other parts of temporarily occupied areas, was, is, and will always be Ukraine. No matter how long will it take, Ukraine will fight for the territorial integrity, restoration of our country. Our vision is very clear. Ukraine is not an obstacle to peace. We are ready to meet in any format. We are ready to start talking about the peace settlement. But there should be truce, there should be legally binding security guarantees, there should be Russian responsibility. Russia should withdraw its forces from the territory of Ukraine. That's clear. No matter what, Ukrainian nation is extremely resilient and will fight for our freedom because this is the only country that we have. This is our home, this is our family. And let me reassure you, Russia is not winning. It doesn't have any strategic advances anywhere. This is propaganda and disinformation that Russia spreads among different countries and partners. Russia is not winning. And Ukraine is capable of winning this war if we have necessary military aid, air defense, security guarantees. Mr. President, if Russia goes unpunished, it will seek to expand the war to the West and to other countries. We need to raise the cost of aggression for Russia. Otherwise, Russia will not stop. And as we approach to the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter, we should ask ourselves, are we doing enough to stop Russia? Is 12 years enough to stop Russia? Are we doing enough to bring Russia to responsibility? Every single day, our children, innocent civilians, are being killed in the middle of Europe. Dear colleagues, we urge you to mobilize more efforts to support Ukraine, militarily, politically, financially, and in terms of security guarantees. Ukraine shall prevail. Democracy shall prevail. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, today we are once again compelled to attend this rather bizarre meeting of the UN General Assembly, which is entirely divorced from reality. We all understand full well that the so-called temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are a figment of the imagination of the leaders of the Kiev regime. In reality, these are new entities of the Russian Federation, entities which became a part of Russia following an informed and free vote by their residents. The choice to become a part of Russia, made by the people of the Crimea, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as well as the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, was not only a restoration of historic justice, it was an expression of the will of the people, of their determination to stand with those to whom they are bound by centuries of traditions, culture, language, and a common history. The reasons for this, we should not look for them in Russia's actions, but rather in the deliberate Russophobic policy of the neo-Nazi regime, which acceded to power with Western backing, a regime which left us no other choice. The referenda in Crimea in March of 2014, and also in 4 other former Ukrainian regions in September 2022, were conducted in accordance with the UN Charter, the International Covenant on Human Rights in 1966, the Helsinki Final Act of the CSE dated 1975, as well as the conclusion drawn by the ICJ on Kosovo on the 22nd of July 2010, which confirmed the fact that a unilateral proclamation of independence by part of a state does not violate any norm of international law. Against this backdrop, we regret to note that the UN General Assembly, at the behest of the accomplices of the Kiev regime, continues to reproduce an erroneous and politically motivated construct that is the so-called occupation of territories. This is simply a tool for manipulating public opinion. It's not a category of international law. Kiev and its allies are in vain trying to use resolutions which do not garner broad support from member states simply to give an air of universality to their unilateral approaches. This practice does nothing to strengthen the organization's credibility. On the contrary, it increases divisions among states, turning the General Assembly from a forum for equal dialogue into a platform for political pressure being exerted. We're particularly perplexed by the demonstratively selective approach of Western states to the application of international legal law norms. Thus, in Kosovo, they were content with a declaration by the parliament to recognize Kosovo's independence. Yet in Crimea, a direct mass referendum was simply ignored. As we can see, the rules which Western states use as the rationale for their so-called world order, these rules are altered to suit these circumstances. De facto, they divide peoples into the right ones and the wrong ones, those who do have the right to fight for freedom and independence and those who do not. Thus, Ukraine's Western sponsors are, in practice, denying millions of Russian-speaking citizens who, for years, were subjected to discrimination and violence. They're denying them their lawful right to self-determination. And this is not simply a political slogan. This is a fundamental principle enshrined in the UN Charter. In light of this, we'd like to recall a declaration on the principles of international law adopted by the UN General Assembly, a declaration which refers to the friendly relations among states and cooperation between them as well. The declaration states that the principle of respect for territorial integrity applies only to those states, the governments of which genuinely represent the entire people and uphold their enjoyment to self-determination. In other words, a state, the authorities of which does not embody the interests of a significant proportion of the population, cannot use the principle of territorial integrity as a fig leaf. This fully applies to the Kiev regime. Its inhumane nature became clear immediately after the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014, when the backers of the coup burnt Russian-speaking activists alive in Odessa and sent tanks and military airplanes, set them on the peaceful cities of the Donbass. As confirmed in January 2024 in the decision of the International Court of Justice, there were no terrorists in the Donbass against which a counterterrorism operation could have been justified. Russia sought ways of settling the conflict trying to convince the leaders of the Donbass to repudiate dialogue with the Kiev authorities despite the crimes they've committed against the people in the southeast of the country. These diplomatic efforts paved the way for the February 2015 package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which offered an opportunity for intra-Ukrainian reconciliation. As was later admitted by European leaders, including the former German Chancellor, Ms. Merkel, and the French President, François Hollande, as well as the President of Ukraine at the time, Petro Poroshenko, none of these leaders actually intended to implement the Minsk agreements. They simply needed to win time to continue preparing Ukraine for a big war against Russia, to send weapons into Ukraine, and to bolster the Ukrainian armed forces' military capabilities. The Kiev authorities always had the opportunity to stop and to go down the path of negotiations to restore peace in Ukraine. First, the Minsk package of measures, and then the Istanbul process. The Istanbul process was practically completed with the due regard given to Ukraine's proposals. It's rather telling that after we, in late March 2022, withdrew our forces from the Ukrainian capital, Zelensky continued to pretend that there were no agreements. He continued to do what his European and American sponsors were spurring him to do, that is, to fight against Russia to the last Ukrainian president. Today, those same European countries, in pursuit of their own interests, well, they didn't allow for peace to be achieved just over 3 years ago. And now they're winding up Ukraine to continue not to achieve and seek just and lasting peace, but to continue the war, to use Ukrainian hands to inflict as many cuts on Russia as possible. And this despite the fact that many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have perished in these Western geopolitical games. After all, Ukraine is simply a pawn which will be sacrificed when necessary, and once it's fulfilled its function, it will no longer be needed. That's why today they're sparing no effort to undermine the understandings reached at the recent Russo-American summit in Alaska, which could result in lasting and long-term settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. President, since the reunification with the historic Russian lands, much work is underway to integrate our new regions and to ensure their accelerated socioeconomic development. We've launched a comprehensive program which includes roughly 300 different projects against all work streams: infrastructure, the economy, health, and education. Since 2022, we've reconstructed and built almost 23,000 various sites, including residential housing, schools, hospitals, and medical facilities. We have completely renovated the multifamily homes, and people are now being moved out of emergency housing. We've repaired over 5,000 kilometers worth of roads, and we plan to restore 10,000 more. 2.5 million people are getting social and pension benefits. In a decade, the economy of the Crimea has shown impressive results. For instance, manufacturing has grown by a factor of 2, the food industry by 1.5. Electronics and optics have grown 5-fold. The gross regional product of the Crimea is over 750 billion rubles. That's comparable to the GDP of small states. Tourist numbers are growing steadily. In this year alone, the peninsula, despite the ever-present security threats emanating from Ukraine, drew over 5 million tourists. By way of conclusion, I'd like to underscore that Russia stands ready to partake in political and diplomatic efforts to settle the conflict. Yet we must understand, in order for peace to be truly lasting, all parties involved must take into account these new territorial realities which arose after the Crimea and 4 more regions became a part of the Russian Federation. This simply has to be recognized. It's that simple. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada, who will speak on behalf of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, colleagues. As the President has said, I have the honor to speak on behalf of Australia, New Zealand, and my own country, Canada. Let me begin by reaffirming our unwavering support to a member state, the state of Ukraine. Not a regime, but a state, a member state. Its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and the peace to which Ukraine is fully entitled. All of which are enshrined in the UN Charter. All of which are threatened. All of which have been violated by the Russian Federation through its unprovoked war of aggression, as was found indeed by the International Court of Justice. My own Prime Minister had the honor to join President Zelensky in Ukraine on the 24th of August for its 34th Independence Day. At that time, Prime Minister Carney underscored that Ukraine was at the front line of the struggle for democracy and for freedom. Ukraine is fighting not only in just legal self-defense, in line with our UN Charter, but in defense of values that are shared by all of us. We need to understand that the cost to the victims of Russian aggression is enormous and is ongoing. The courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people are worthy of every accolade. The situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine shows us what is at stake. Russia does not, in fact, want us to know what is happening there. If the situation is as rosy as the Russian delegate has told us it is, why then is he not allowing the eyes and ears of the world to see what is happening? Humanitarian access is blocked. The UN monitoring teams that have been welcomed and supported by Ukraine are denied access to areas under Russian control. Despite this, courageous attempts continue to get a true picture of life under Russian control, and it is a grim picture that has emerged. Forced disappearances and political arrests, the abduction of children, the systematic use of torture by the Russian state, including against prisoners of war. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has documented multiple acts by Russian authorities which they have determined amount to crimes against humanity. And let us remember, when we talk about Russia, we're talking about the only permanent member of the Security Council to be listed by the Secretary General as a state committing grave violations affecting children in situations of armed conflict. Russia, the only permanent member of the Security Council to be put on notice for listing by the Secretary General as a state responsible for patterns of rape or other forms of sexual violence. Let us be clear. The return from Russian state control of Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped, every prisoner of war who has been captured and then abused, and every unlawfully detained civilian is not just a priority for Ukraine. It is not just an issue for Ukraine. It is a universal and humanitarian imperative. Our three countries are committed to supporting these objectives, and we call on countries that are now supporting Russia's war effort to stop. This includes Belarus, Iran, and North Korea. This cooperation shows the global security implications of Russia's aggression, which the General Assembly has deplored in multiple resolutions, but the Security Council has not been able to do much about it. Colleagues, let's be clear. Despite some rhetoric you may hear, it's abundantly clear and very well documented that it is President Putin who has caused this tragedy, the tragedy that has subsequently claimed the lives of millions of people. Today, it is apparent by the conditions that have just been laid out, by what you've heard about the denial of the principle of territorial integrity, the denial of the principle of the rights to sovereignty, the denial of the findings of international tribunals and courts, which have clearly stated that there is, in fact, no justification that can be proved to anybody except President Putin for the war that has been unleashed. Let's be clear. Not only is Russia not ready for diplomacy, it continues, despite its words, to delay the end to this invasion, to rain down missiles on civilians, to extend the suffering in Ukrainian territory that it controls. Ukraine has been very clear again today in the statement made by the Deputy Foreign Minister. Ukraine is ready for the unconditional ceasefire that this General Assembly, except Russia, wants. Just stop it. Just stop it now. Ukraine has agreed to stop it if Russia stops it. If you want peace, stop it. Stop the fighting. President Zelensky has said he's ready to meet President Putin to launch a genuine peace process and to find a diplomatic solution to this war. For our part, we welcome the efforts of the United States and other states around the world to support these negotiations, to support the principle of ceasefire and negotiation. We are also committed to supporting Ukraine in order to achieve the just and lasting peace that our resolutions have talked about. So let's be clear, it's simple. It's not complicated. We're calling for a ceasefire, direct negotiations at the leader level, obviously in a neutral place, a place that both parties can agree to, a peace agreement that is in accordance with international law, and a peace agreement that will ensure that Russia never again threatens the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Colleagues, this is a reasonable path, a logical path, a rational path, a pragmatic path to peace that is also in line with the principles of the UN Charter and our shared values. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden, who will speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic Group, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. Kherson is Ukraine. Zaporizhzhia is Ukraine. Donetsk is Ukraine. Luhansk is Ukraine. Crimea is Ukraine. Sevastopol is Ukraine. There can be no reward for aggression. We must never accept a world where the strong act without restraint and others are condemned to suffer. Speaking in this chamber, let one truth be abundantly clear. Russia has chosen a war of aggression. Ukraine, by contrast, exercises its inherent right to self-defense enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. There can be no false balance between aggressor and victim. Russia and its leadership must be held accountable. It is our common duty to support Ukraine in its legitimate pursuit of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, a peace rooted firmly in international law. The alternative, a so-called peace where the foundations of international law are trampled upon, would have grave consequences for us all. First, it would set the stage for renewed Russian aggression against Ukraine, for the Kremlin has not abandoned its goal of subjugation and domination. Second, it would embolden other potential aggressors across the globe, placing all nations at risk. This year, we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations Charter. 80 years on, the principles forged in the aftermath of the Second World War remain our compass today. To recognize territorial acquisitions by military force would be a violation of international law and would set a detrimental precedent for international peace and security. Nor can we allow impunity for the crimes committed in the temporarily occupied territories in Ukraine. Independent UN mechanisms continue to document severe repression, arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial killings, and sexual and gender-based violence. Russia's forced deportations, transfers, and abductions of children are unlawful and unjustifiable. Russia must return all children immediately. Every moment counts. International humanitarian law must prevail, and unfettered access to occupied territories must be ensured. Mr. President, in all this hardship, Ukraine has demonstrated extraordinary resilience. We are in awe of its bravery. The Nordic Baltic countries will continue to stand with Ukraine. We will strengthen our political, military, and economic support today, tomorrow, and in the future. We must all work together to reverse the philosophy that might makes right and prove that right makes might. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Thailand.
Very much, Mr. President. Thailand expressed profound concern about the dire humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We are indeed deeply saddened by the loss of lives, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the hardship endured by people living on the ground. In this critical juncture, Mr. President, we would like to underscore three key points. First of all, Thailand reaffirms our unwavering commitment to upholding the purposes and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, as well as the obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Thailand fully supports the peaceful settlement of disputes and reiterates its call on all parties to engage in constructive dialogue that is inclusive, forward-looking, and grounded in mutual trust and respect, with an aim to de-escalate tensions and find a sustainable pathway towards peace. We welcome all diplomatic efforts in this regard, including peace negotiations held in Alaska and Washington, D.C., as well as meetings convened by the Coalition of Willing. We hope that the proposed Ukraine-Russia summit will take place at the earliest opportunity. Secondly, Thailand is gravely concerned about the devastating humanitarian consequences of this protracted conflict. We therefore continue to urge all parties to exercise utmost restraint to prevent further escalation of conflicts and protect lives of innocent civilians. In solidarity with the international community, Thailand joins the call for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire to alleviate people's suffering and ensure unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance. On our part, we have continued to extend humanitarian assistance both in the forms of financial contributions and relief items for the people in the affected areas, most recently in January 2025 through the Thai Red Cross Society. This indeed reflects our long-standing humanitarian tradition. And lastly, Thailand underscores the critical importance of reconstruction efforts to restore livelihoods and the well-being of the people on the ground. We stand ready to support reconstruction initiatives in close cooperation with the international community and relevant United Nations agencies, particularly in the areas of housing, public facilities, and essential infrastructure in the affected areas. Mr. President, Thailand firmly believes that conflicts can only be resolved by dialogue and engagement. We hope that all parties will redouble their efforts in this regard toward the peaceful resolution of the situation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is 1,289 days since the start of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So the timing of today's debate underlines for all of us what is at stake when we talk about ongoing peace efforts. Russia's war in Ukraine is a manifest violation of the UN Charter and a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, both of which, for all of us, are enshrined in the UN Charter. The truth is that the Russian state has temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories and has sought to consolidate control within them with violence. They have sought to eliminate any trace of Ukrainian statehood and identity through repression. We know exactly what Russia's invasion and violation of the UN Charter mean for Ukrainian civilians in these territories. It means severe restrictions on their freedom of association, their freedom of movement, and their freedom of religious belief. It means systematic detention of innocent civilians and forced deportation and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. It means lack of access to humanitarian aid for the most vulnerable. It means erasure of Ukrainian cultural heritage and despicable attempts to militarize their youth. It means rape and sexual violence, which have been used repeatedly by Russia as tools of war. The human toll of President Putin's continued illegal, unjustifiable invasion against Ukraine is immense. For many of the 1.5 million people living in the temporarily occupied territories, these horrors are a daily reality. This reality is unacceptable. As the Russian state continues to terrorize civilians in the territories it occupies, using arbitrary detention, torture, and indoctrination as instruments of control, Ukraine has consistently sought a commitment to peace. But the appalling attacks on civilians over the last week have made Russia's intentions clearer than ever. Yet the strength and endless determination of the Ukrainian people, both in Kyiv and across the temporarily occupied territories, continues to inspire us. So we call on Russia to comply with international law, to comply with the UN Charter. President Putin has the power to end this war today. The next steps are clear. Putin needs to agree to an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire and withdraw Russian forces from all of Ukraine's territory. Ukraine needs security guarantees to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, in recent weeks, we have seen some encouraging progress in peace talks to end Russia's war against Ukraine, made possible above all by Ukraine's resolve and flexibility. No doubt, we all want to see an end to the vast destruction and the relentless killing unleashed by Russia's decision to invade its sovereign neighbor, a sovereign member of the United Nations. That illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine must end now. But it bears recalling that no one wishes for peace more than the Ukrainians themselves. Mr. President, it is simply outrageous that Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, continues to violate the fundamental norms and principles of international law and the UN Charter. Not only has it attempted to redraw borders by force, Russia now floats notions of so-called land swaps. Such proposals are not only ruthless and unjustified, but they also stand in direct contradiction to the very principle of territorial integrity. Ukraine land is not and will not be subject to negotiation or exchange. From the legal point of view, the occupied territories are not and will not be part of Russia. Any suggestion to the contrary undermines the very foundations of the international order. Moreover, while Ukraine and its allies have engaged in negotiations in good faith, the Russian leadership has cynically exploited these talks to buy time and evade international censure. All the while, it has been launching unprecedented and deadly attacks against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and even foreign diplomatic missions in Ukraine. This deliberate game of delay and continued aggression must cease immediately. It has now become clear that Russia is not genuinely interested in peace. Every day of equivocation, every day of postponing an effective international response means more bereaved families, more shattered Ukrainian cities, and greater strain on the rules-based international order. The sooner we act to end this injustice and uphold international law, the better it will be for all of us, and most of all, for the people of Ukraine. They deserve a just and durable peace. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming Czechia's firm support for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and its right to determine its own future, free from coercion and violence. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Czechia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, almost 1,300 days have passed since Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal full-scale aggression against Ukraine began. 1,300 days of relentless bombardments of civilians, of energy infrastructure, of hospitals and schools, and most recently, even of diplomatic premises. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. Thousands of lives have been lost. Austria mourns every innocent victim of this senseless war and reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with Ukraine in the face of this blatant aggression. Russia's assault is not only an attack on Ukraine. It's an attack on the very foundations of our international order, on the simple but fundamental principles that disputes must be resolved through dialogue, not war. and that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states are inviolable. This war is but one piece in a troubling global mosaic of actions that undermine the order upon which this organization is built, the principles of the UN Charter and the rule of international law. Russia's attack has also eroded trust within Europe and beyond, trust in institutions, in dialogue, in cooperative security. It has shaken Europe's security architecture and challenged vital instruments, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, headquartered in Vienna. Rebuilding this trust will require extraordinary efforts. Excellencies, no one longs for peace more than the people of Ukraine. A comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, anchored in the UN Charter and international law, as this Assembly has repeatedly demanded. Austria welcomes all serious and credible initiatives to end this war and supports efforts led by US President Trump. But let us be clear, peace requires more than words. It requires Russia to demonstrate genuine readiness to engage on a path to peace, as the Security Council has demanded. Instead, Moscow has escalated its attacks since the Security Council's demand. July was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since May 2022. While speaking of peace, Russia rains missiles on Ukraine. This must end. Meaningful negotiations cannot take place while Russia continues its brutal assault. Ukraine has shown its willingness for an immediate ceasefire, and I encourage all countries to support this call. Austria stands ready to support peace. As we've said before, we remain prepared to host talks in Vienna if the parties so wish. Excellencies, dear colleagues, this war is not a European problem. Its consequences are global. Vulnerable countries in particular feel its ripple effects. Delayed shipments of life-saving food, surging energy prices, and the ever-present specter of nuclear catastrophe. The United Nations, alongside organizations like the OSCE, has an important role to play, not only in providing life-saving humanitarian assistance today, in helping secure Ukraine's nuclear facilities, and in documenting crimes and violations, but also in the future, in monitoring peace, in fostering reconciliation, and in securing Ukraine's reconstruction. Austria will continue to do its part through diplomacy and humanitarian support. As a militarily neutral country, we do not supply weapons. But neutrality does not mean indifference. Austria has already contributed close to 400 million of US dollars in bilateral financial and humanitarian aid, in addition to the aid provided by the European Union. We stand ready to assist in Ukraine's reconstruction, including through hosting a dedicated reconstruction conference in Vienna. Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, Austria's message is simple. The war must end, justice must prevail, and peace must be built on the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, after more than 3 years of conflict, the path to peace in Ukraine remains elusive. Civilians are the ones bearing the heaviest cost of conflicts. Cities are devastated, millions are uprooted, and global food and energy security are disrupted. It has shaken the very foundation of the multilateral system, yet Indonesia believes deeply that the door to peace must never be shut. Even in the darkest hour, diplomacy must remain as the only responsible way forward. Our message, therefore, must be clear. First, prioritize dialogue and peaceful resolution of dispute. Conflicts end when adversaries sit together, address their differences, and make the difficult choice of compromise over destruction. The international community must redouble its effort to support the creation of conditions conducive to meaningful negotiations, to encourage inclusive peace initiatives, and to avoid zero-sum game approaches. Second, safeguard the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and prohibition of the use of force are not optional. They are imperative as the foundation of global peace and stability. All parties must fully adhere to international humanitarian law, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and guarantee safe and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. Third, strengthen international unity and prevent escalation. Bridging divides today is the only way to prevent deeper crises tomorrow. The longer this conflict endures, the greater the risk of miscalculation, spillover, and irreparable fragmentation of the international system. The UN and its members must act not as divided blocs, but as a single community committed to de-escalation, confidence building, and the eventual reintegration of trust between nations. Equally important is our unwavering commitment to alleviate the suffering of the innocents. Mr. President, Indonesia will continue to speak with one consistent voice. There can be no double standard in the pursuit of peace, whether in Ukraine, Gaza, or everywhere. Humanity must always come first. Every life lost is a reminder that delay comes at a cost we can never repay. Let us therefore act with urgency, courage, and humility to end this conflict and create a lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. We now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Luxembourg fully aligns itself with the statement that will be made by the European Union. Allow me to supplement it with these remarks in my national capacity. I thank you for having convened this debate on the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. As Russian armed forces ratchet up their missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian cities, and as they continue to target the civilian population, I wish at this rostrum to reaffirm Luxembourg's unwavering solidarity with the Ukrainian government and people. They are courageously resisting the Russian aggression. Luxembourg condemns in the very strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are violations of international humanitarian law. They are unacceptable and must stop now. For 6 months now, Ukraine has expressed its readiness to establish a ceasefire, the first step towards a just, comprehensive and lasting peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter, international law and relevant UN resolutions. However, Russia continues to kill civilians on a daily basis. This war is raging on solely because the aggressor refuses to put an end to it. Luxembourg unequivocally supports the independence, unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, in accordance with the resolutions that have been adopted by this General Assembly since 2014. The Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and Crimea and the city of Sebastopol are an integral part of Ukraine's territory. Russia's actions are not only an attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, they also undermine the very principles of the United Nations, multilateralism, and the international order based on the rule of law and the sovereign equality of states. There can be no overemphasis of the principle enshrined in Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. It reads, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. End quote. The Charter is our common good. It is our bulwark against attacks waged by those that want to see the principle of might is right prevail over the strength of law. We are deeply shocked by the senseless violence and the growing body of testimony and reports documenting attacks of unconscionable brutality against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, rapes and other forms of sexual violence, particularly targeting women and children. We also read a growing number of accounts of the deportation of Ukrainian children to Russian territory. We must be absolutely lucid in our assessment. Russia's acts are a crime of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. We must leave no stone unturned in order to ensure that the perpetrators of these crimes are held accountable and in order to ensure justice is done for the victims who must be at the heart of our efforts. Mr. President, since 2014, Russia has flagrantly violated the purposes and principles of the United Nations by attacking Ukraine and by occupying its territory. In view of the Security Council's deadlock as a result of Russia's veto, it is the General Assembly that has mobilized to ensure that we see prevail an international order based on the force of law and not the principle of might is right. Last February, the Security Council finally adopted a resolution, but Russia has violated it for months. We must remain mobilized until Russian troops have left every last inch of Ukrainian territory. We commend the efforts undertaken by the United States to put an end to Russia's war of aggression. In any peace effort, Ukraine must be at the negotiating table, as must the European Union, and the guns must be silenced during the peace talks. Moreover, in order to be sustainable, the peace must be accompanied by robust security guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine can continue to count on Luxembourg's support in the United Nations, and in other fora. We will continue to work at all levels for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Luxembourg. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes today's General Assembly debate on the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Today's debate is about a core principle of the United Nations and its charter, which we all defend in this hall and beyond. The principle of sovereignty of a UN member state whose territory has been occupied twice in the last almost 12 years by another UN state, which is a permanent member of the Security Council. In 2014, Romania did not recognize the attempted illegal occupation of the Crimea Peninsula and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. Subsequently, we did not recognize the occupation of parts of the Ukrainian territory by Russia since February 2022, nor did we recognize sham elections organized in those regions. Romania condemns Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. The population of Ukraine in the temporarily occupied territories is the most affected one. On the one hand, the state authorities cannot take the necessary measures to protect Ukrainian citizens and residents therein in absence of an effective control over their territory. On the other hand, in the occupied territories, the human rights situation is worsening, and reports of atrocities committed by the forces of the occupying power come to light periodically. Reports of international governmental and non-governmental organizations, including the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, the UN Commission of Inquiry, or the SRSG on Children in Armed Conflict, highlight that Russia has committed violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in the territory of Ukraine, which it occupies. The perpetrators of such atrocities must be held responsible for their actions. We recall in this respect the basic obligations of an occupying power that arise under the Fourth Geneva Convention and other relevant IHL treaties and customary law, including the humane treatment and protection of civilians, the prohibition of forcible transfers, and the protection of private property. We cannot be bystanders while accountability is so much needed. Staying silent makes us accessories to impunity. We welcome the signing on 25th of June this year of the agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine on the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. It is an important message for justice, accountability, and fighting against impunity for the crime of aggression committed against Ukraine. Romania actively participates in the meetings of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee on an International Treaty to establish a Claims Commission for Ukraine that have been organized since March 2025 and which, as of today, moved under the umbrella of the Council of Europe. We should not forget that the starting point of this endeavor was the United Nations General Assembly Resolution ES 11/5, adopted on 14 November 2022, which recognizes that the Russian Federation must bear the legal consequences of all of its internationally wrongful acts, including making reparation for the injury, including any damage caused by such acts. Mr. President, Romania remains an unconditional supporter for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We also recognize Ukraine's right of self-defense against the Russian aggression. My delegation remains also a staunch supporter of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine needs our support to defend itself on the basis of the Charter. We remain committed to achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter and the resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council. Romania also welcomes the efforts undertaken by the United States to put an end to Russia's war of aggression, stop the suffering of the Ukrainian people, stop the killings, and save lives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy aligns itself with the statement that will be delivered by the European Union, and I would like here to add a few words in my national capacity. Today's plenary meeting is another opportunity for us to reiterate Italy's unwavering support for Ukraine in its pursuit of a just and lasting peace, firmly rooted in the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. On the occasion of Ukraine's Independence Day, last 44th of August, Italy paid a heartfelt tribute to the strength and courage of the Ukrainian people, who have been steadfastly defending their independence, freedom, and national identity for over 3 years. Today, we are convened here after the recent and most brutal Russian attacks in Ukraine, another clear breach of international law. Italy reiterates its full commitment to addressing the profound humanitarian consequences related to the conflict. One of the main objectives that we should pursue is ensuring full support to the Ukrainian civilian population, which is under heavy attack by the Russian army. Our thoughts go to the Ukrainian people, to civilians, to the families of defenseless victims, including children. In this respect, Italy highlights the importance of ensuring the return of Ukrainian children taken by Russia, an issue of which Italy is also engaged through the dedicated international coalition. There is an urgent need for an immediate ceasefire and meaningful negotiations for peace. Only a diplomatic solution to the conflict, based on the UN Charter and international law, with the full involvement of Ukraine and Europe, can lead to a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. We firmly believe that the full implementation of these principles is not only in the interest of Ukraine and Europe, but also of the entire UN membership, since they are the foundations that hold the international community together. In this respect, we welcome the efforts led by the United States to achieve such a peace. Italy reiterates its willingness to contribute to effective negotiations and stresses the importance of ensuring robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine. Unwavering support for independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine has been a priority for Italy since the beginning of the conflict. While strongly backing the European Union initiatives, Italy is also contributing to ensure Ukraine's resilience and intends to play an active role in the social and economic recovery of the country, as well as its reconstructions. In this spirit, last July, we hosted in Rome the Ukrainian Recovery Conference, which saw, among other things, the participation of over 2,000 companies and secured 10 billion euros in commitments, with more than 200 agreements signed. Together, we will lay the foundations for a prosperous, independent Ukraine. We remain committed to collaborating with all partners ready to support peace efforts. Now is the time to intensify our collective efforts to achieve this goal. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, distinguished delegates and honored guests, we are grateful to Ukraine for organizing this important annual debate. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine war is the largest and deadliest war in Europe since World War II. It continues to rage on. The death toll and the scale of destruction in both Ukraine and Russia continue to grow. This is a devastating war that should never have started. That is why the United States, under President Trump, has undertaken exceptional efforts to bring this war to an end. President Trump met face-to-face with Russian President Putin in Alaska on August 15th, and then hosted Ukrainian President Zelensky and 7 other European leaders at the White House on August 18th to build on the progress of multiple rounds of talks. The next step is for Russia and Ukraine's leaders to meet bilaterally and ultimately to agree on an end to the fighting. Just days after President Trump welcomed President Putin on American soil to discuss ending the war, Russia launched the second largest aerial attack on Ukraine since the war began, hitting Ukrainian homes, as well as buildings housing the European Union delegation and the British Council. These continued attacks cast doubt on the seriousness of Russia's desire for peace. Strikes on civilian areas must stop immediately. Mr. President, while the United States continues its efforts to encourage direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, we should remember that the war did not begin with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. At that point, Russia had already illegally purported to annex Crimea and had occupied Ukrainian sovereign territory for 8 years. Colleagues, the United Nations was established to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. We call on Russia to fulfill its obligations and both parties to negotiate in good faith and end the war in a durable manner through diplomacy. We urge all UN member states to join the United States in demanding an immediate, durable, and lasting end to a war of choice that is devastating lives and destroying 2 countries. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Mr. President, Deputy Minister Betzer, Excellencies, Portugal aligns with the statement to be delivered by the European Union and would like to state the following in its national capacity. We have been gathering at this General Assembly every year since 2018 to discuss the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And I recall
that in February of this year, we also gathered here and discussed the situation in Ukraine under the 11th emergency special session, when we then voted and adopted not one, but 2 resolutions on Ukraine, focusing on peace, thus giving a clear sign to all relevant parties of the membership's collective wish for a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace in Ukraine, in line with the principles of the UN Charter. Yet, half a year has gone, and the conflict persists. We reiterate our call for international unity in supporting Ukraine's defense of sovereignty while working towards an end to the fighting and the war of aggression. We welcome the efforts and the mediation initiatives conducted by several member states. But recent large-scale attacks cast serious doubts on the will to engage constructively in peace efforts. We particularly deplore the systematic target by Russia of civilian infrastructures. More must be done to put an end to the killing of civilians and to ensure due respect for international humanitarian law, international law, and for these General Assembly's resolutions. Mr. President, any peace agreement must uphold UN Charter, principles, and international law, particularly the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. We remain deeply concerned with the systematic persecution and arbitrary detention of journalists, human rights defenders, and ordinary citizens in the Ukrainian occupied territories. We urge Russia to fully comply with international humanitarian law and establish safe humanitarian corridors, providing access of assistance and verification mechanisms to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We are gravely concerned over Russia's deliberate policy of forcible deportation and illegal adoption of Ukrainian children. Portugal calls for the return of all abducted Ukrainian children and other civilian unlawfully deported. Indeed, since the beginning of the war, Portugal has provided financial support for humanitarian purposes through multilateral and bilateral channels, including contributions for the creation of educational centers in hospitals to provide support for hospitalized children. Aware of the global effects of the conflict, we have also supported the Food for Ukraine initiative to fight food insecurity worldwide while also helping Ukrainian agriculture. And we stand ready to continue providing support to Ukraine, including at military level, thus ensuring Kyiv has the required capabilities to defend itself. Mr. President, Deputy Minister Betsa, Excellencies, Portugal will continue to support efforts towards a just and lasting peace that respects Ukraine's right to make decisions about its own territory, thus ensuring long-term security for Ukraine and for the European continent. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Portugal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, let me start by thanking Your Excellency for convening this session at a time when we find ourselves in a conundrum about the war in Ukraine, stuck between intensified efforts for peaceful settlement and the grim reality of unrelenting attacks. After years of intense conflict with immense humanitarian consequences, the war in Ukraine continues to have profound global implications for international peace and security. The ongoing aggression against Ukraine and the failure to achieve a diplomatic solution adversely affects European and global security. The war retains its devastating impact on the region, and innocent civilians are paying the highest price. It is precisely at a time like this that we must persist in seeking a peaceful and negotiated settlement of this lengthy and destructive conflict. Since the very outset of the conflict, Turkey has assumed a leading role in international diplomatic efforts aimed at securing a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Our unwavering commitment to diplomacy is guided by the principles of international law, the United Nations Charter, and the imperative of ensuring Ukraine's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, since May this year, Turkey has hosted 3 rounds of direct negotiations between the warring parties in Istanbul. Istanbul talks served as a cornerstone for confidence building, enabling process on humanitarian issues and making dialogue possible. It was the necessary first step that created the working space for parties to engage with each other. The genuine momentum of Istanbul talks must now widen its scope. Turkey remains ready and willing to host a possible leaders' summit or a 4th meeting on technical delegations level to prepare for the summit in Istanbul. We also welcome the US President Trump's direct contacts with the warring sides and hope that the US involvement in negotiation process will help the sides reach a mutually acceptable agreement. Mr. President, among all these, we believe that the UN's role in the pursuit of peace in Ukraine is vital. There is room for the UN to play a greater role in the process, given its track record in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Any peace agreement should be drafted in accordance with the international law and the UN Charter. It remains critical to stay focused on the track of diplomacy. Ultimately, a just peace can only be achieved through direct dialogue and mutual understanding. Turkey, cognizant of the global humanitarian impact of the war, will proceed with its diplomatic efforts to peacefully end the war. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shall begin by reiterating my country's condemnation of this war in violation of international law, the UN Charter, and its principles. We remain deeply concerned about the grave humanitarian consequences, in particular, the continued attacks on civilian and energy infrastructure. These attacks must stop immediately. Civilians, including humanitarian and health workers, as well as civilian infrastructure, are protected under international humanitarian law. That must be respected, and in this regard, we call for safe and rapid humanitarian access to all civilians in need. Slovakia has consistently supported all relevant initiatives aimed at ending this war. In particular, we welcome the recent efforts of the President of the United States, which have our full support. The summit between the Presidents of the United States and the Russian Federation, followed by the meeting with President Zelensky and representatives of European states, European Union, and NATO, represents a significant step towards fostering dialogue and seeking solutions. This strong engagement is a clear signal of determination to end this devastating conflict as soon as possible. We appreciate and welcome Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction efforts. Slovakia expresses its readiness to participate in projects that help rebuild Ukraine based on long-term and effective cooperation. In this regard, we also welcome engagement of other partners, including United Nations. Slovakia fully supports all negotiations conducted in good faith based on constructive approach aimed at achieving an immediate and full ceasefire. This should serve as the first step toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace fully in line with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Slovakia attaches high importance to its relations with Ukraine, our partner and neighboring country. We stand in full support of Ukraine's European integration ambitions, and we also value the open and constructive dialogue between our countries, which will continue at the highest political level, actually tomorrow, during the planned meeting of the Prime Minister of Slovakia with President Zelensky. We look forward to the upcoming high-level week, which will provide a space for further dialogue and engagement of wider UN membership. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovakia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, we condemn Russia's war of aggression, as well as its devastating impact on civilians. Given the dramatic deterioration of the situation, Switzerland would like to reaffirm its staunch support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, I would like to make the following points. First, Russia's annexation of additional Ukrainian territories in September of 2022 constitutes a flagrant violation of international law. Switzerland condemns this violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Switzerland does not recognize the incorporation of these regions into the Russian Federation. Furthermore, in 2014, Switzerland condemned the illegal referendum held on the 16th of March, a referendum on Crimea, and then the subsequent annexation thereof in violation of international law. This assembly is the place to recall the fundamental principles etched in the UN Charter: the sovereign equality of states, respect for their territorial integrity, and a prohibition on the use of force as a means of settling disputes. Second, Switzerland calls on all parties to painstakingly respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Safe, rapid, and unfettered humanitarian access to all civilians in need must be guaranteed, as required by international humanitarian law. We'd like to recall that since the large-scale invasion of 2022, humanitarian access to the occupied Ukrainian territories has been blocked. We call on all parties to restore access without delay so that humanitarian organizations can carry out their vital mission. Turning to the protection of civilians in the occupied territories, we urge Russia to meticulously comply with its obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention, inter alia. We strongly condemn deportations and forced transfers, including of children. We further condemn arbitrary arrests and call for the release of all persons arbitrarily detained. Third, we call on Russia to immediately de-escalate the situation, to cease its military operations and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Switzerland welcomes all initiatives aimed at dialogue with a view to establishing comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine on the basis of international law, including the UN Charter. We encourage all parties involved to pursue discussions with a view to ending the war by diplomatic means, and to do so doggedly. Switzerland reaffirms its readiness to offer its good offices if the parties so wish. In 2026, Switzerland will be taking up the chairmanship of the OSCE. This chairmanship is part and parcel of Switzerland's ongoing commitment to actively contributing to peace, security, and stability in Europe and beyond. Mr. President, we will continue to speak out on behalf of the residents of the temporarily occupied regions. Let us work together to make comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine a reality. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, more than 3 years have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an escalation of the aggression that began in 2014. Croatia condemns in the strongest terms this unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression, as well as the illegal attempted annexation of Ukraine's territory. These acts are a blatant violation of the UN Charter and a direct assault on the principles that protect peace, sovereignty, and equality among nations. The consequences remain devastating. In recent months, attacks on Ukrainian cities, civilians, and energy infrastructure have only intensified, worsening the humanitarian crisis ahead of winter. Reports from the Independent International Commission of Inquiry confirm serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law in areas that came under Russian control. Such crimes must not and cannot be ignored or normalized. Mr. President, the UN Charter remains clear. Disputes must be resolved by peaceful means. Territorial integrity must be respected, and aggression cannot be tolerated. Ending the war in Ukraine is therefore not only a moral imperative, but a test of the credibility of this very organization. A just and sustainable peace cannot come at the expense of justice. It cannot excuse cruelty or reward aggression, because doing so would only sow the seeds of future conflict. It is instead rooted in justice, accountability, and the restoration of sovereignty. Anything short of that would weaken the very rules that protect all nations, large and small, from the use of force. In this regard, Croatia values and supports the determined efforts led by the United States and all partners who stand with Ukraine and work for a just and lasting peace. Such engagement is essential. Mr. President, Croatia reaffirms its unequivocal support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We remain committed to supporting our Ukrainian partners and stand ready to share Croatia's experience in post-war transition and peaceful reintegration of previously occupied territories. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Croatia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, at the outset, Ireland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Our meeting today takes place just 2 weeks before the new session of the General Assembly, and the work at the end of this year follows the logic of finishing this Assembly's necessary agenda as we fulfil our mandate and conclude our routine. However, the basis for this meeting is anything but routine. How can illegal occupation through force ever be routine? How can a full-scale invasion, an act of unprovoked and unjustifiable aggression by a nuclear-armed state, be treated as the norm? This war and the threat posed by Russia is an existential issue for Ukraine and a major challenge to the security of Europe. But it is not only that. It impacts the interests of all states and the core of the UN's purposes. The global legacy of colonialism, for example, of which Ireland is all too familiar, still occupies our time and attention in this building. We often treat it as a historical wrong to be corrected, justice to be fulfilled, delayed self-determination to be finally granted to those who have been denied. Unfortunately, however, colonialism is not just a historical wrong. Russia's actions demonstrate renewed efforts at resorting to might is right in our own time. Brutal daily violence on the front lines and across the occupied territories of Ukraine bring us back to the chaos of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, when some empires felt entitled to take what they wanted, with the result that the weak suffered what they must. President, colleagues, in 1945, we collectively agreed to put an end to that. We declared that the atrocities that follow from such expansionist violence must stop. And now that such horrors have returned in Ukraine, in Palestine, in Sudan, and in other countries, we cannot resign ourselves to inaction. We must not begin to normalize this inhumanity that we work so hard to consign to history. We cannot begin to explain away that which can never be accepted under international law. This applies in the Donbass and in Crimea, as it does in Gaza and in the West Bank. 3.5 years of an illegal war of aggression, unceasing attacks by land, sea and air, and the targeting of civilian infrastructure by the Russian Federation should not be met in this hall with a defeated shrug. We are seeing the rapid erosion of the fundamental basis for multilateralism with this conflict, and with it threats to the integrity and credibility of the UN itself. The example of a permanent member of the Security Council privileging imperial ambitions over global security threatens all of us. It threatens our collective future. It calls into question the capacity for the peaceful settlement of disputes and frays the common threads of our peaceful coexistence as member states of these United Nations. It is important, therefore, that today we make another clear statement together to reaffirm our common commitment to these principles and values that bind all of us, applying equally to all conflicts. President, we all want this conflict to end, but this must be on the basis of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, one that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We know that an end without justice is not peace, and an unjust peace can never last. For those living under Russian occupation in Crimea and across eastern Ukraine, justice and peace remain elusive in the face of unrelenting brutality. Russia's cruel coercive measures force them from their homes, strip them of their nationality, and seek to erase their very identity as Ukrainians. And for some families, their lives are torn apart as Ukrainian children are forced into a new life in Russia under duress. Today, Ireland stands in full solidarity with Ukrainians across Ukraine, in its occupied territories, and with the millions forcibly displaced around the globe. As we look forward to UNGA 80 in the coming weeks, we urgently require progress on the path towards peace in Ukraine and for Europe. Ireland welcomes the ongoing efforts of President Trump and the US to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and to achieve a last and just peace for the country and for our continent. Ireland's position remains clear. It is for Russia to now show through its actions a willingness to achieve peace. Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and President Zelensky have done their part. Any agreement must also protect Ukraine and Europe's vital security. This means strong, credible guarantees that ensure Ukraine can defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity to avoid a repetition of the past. This is in all our interests. It is in the interest of every UN member state. President, as we reflect on the work of the 79th session of the General Assembly, we must confront the painful memory of a tumultuous and violent year. Wars, death, famine, with millions displaced, starving and without hope. We must do better. We can do better. Our work this coming year must be focused on restoring hope for those we represent. And that starts with the recognition that all nations deserve the right that we all claim to determine our own future in peace and security and free from the threat of violence, with the commitment to respecting international law as the basis that underpins our common coexistence. With that solemn commitment, we offer our support and solidarity to Ukraine again today. Let us make this coming GA session the year we urgently restore that common drive towards global peace for all peoples, with the UN Charter at its core, both for Ukraine and for all conflicts. The millions suffering under occupation deserve nothing less. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Madam Deputy Minister, distinguished delegates, for over a decade, Russia has waged a campaign of colonial and imperialistic aggression against Ukraine. It began with the unlawful and occupation and annexation of first of Crimea, then of Donetsk and Lugansk in 2014, which were clear and deliberate attacks on international law and paved the way for the full-scale invasion the world witnessed in 2022. Russia's actions violate a basic truth that no nation can take another's land by force. This is not just a political idea. It is a universal rule written in the United Nations Charter, signed and agreed by all of us. This is why this war is not only about Ukraine. It is about the rules that keep all nations safe. Russia's actions cannot be unanswered and must not go unpunished. There must be justice. There must be accountability. Mr. President, let me be clear. Russia's annexation of Ukraine territory is illegal under international law, and Poland firmly rejects any recognition of these lands as Russian. In these territories, Russia occupies illegally. The suffering is immense and ongoing. Numerous UN investigations confirm widespread human rights violation, from arbitrary detentions and torture to executions and enforced disappearances. In regions like Crimea, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Lugansk, Ukrainians live under daily terror. No one suffers more in war than an innocent, and children have been born some of the worst horrors. Tens of thousands have been forcibly taken to Russia, placed in so-called re-education camps, stripped of their identity, and even given up for forced adoption. These are not isolated incidents. They may constitute war crimes. They may even amount to genocide. The world must not and cannot turn away if we are to stand by the rules of the international order and the UN Charter. Mr. President, Russia's aggression is not merely a military invasion. It is an attempt to reimpose colonial control over a people who had fought for generations to live free. Ukraine's resistance is a part of a larger story of anti-colonial struggle that demands our recognition and support. This Assembly has constantly and with a vast majority reaffirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The world has called for peace, but Russia has answered with more violence, more destruction, and more disregard for international norms. Mr. President, colleagues, this war could end today if Russia simply withdraw from all Ukrainians' internationally recognized territory. We therefore call on Moscow to do so immediately, without delay and without preconditions. Only then can Ukrainians, like all our nations, freely choose their own future, free from coercion, free from occupation. Ukraine has showed many times that it stands ready for dialogue, but peace requires action. Therefore, we support all efforts that lead to open the path for just, comprehensive, and lasting peace. But it requires Russia to stop its military aggression, fully, immediately, and unconditionally. Until that day comes, we will continue to defend Ukraine's right to self-determination, and we will continue to provide strong, practical support for Ukraine's legitimate self-defense against this illegal and brutal aggression and occupation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative for Poland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Mr. President, distinguished Deputy Minister and delegates, Russia's war against Ukraine did not begin in February 2022. It began in 2014 with the illegal attempted annexation of Crimea and the instigation of a proxy war in eastern Ukraine. In February 2022, Russia escalated this aggression into a full-scale invasion, compounding 8 years of prior hostilities. A permanent member of this council, of the Security Council, in blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law, seeks to impose its expansionist ambitions by force. Systematic strikes against civilians and critical infrastructure represent grave breaches of international humanitarian law. Behind the false pretext of denazification lies the true objective, namely the de-Ukrainization of Ukraine. This is pursued through the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage, museums, monuments, and places of worship that embody the soul of the Ukrainian nation. The international community has been unequivocal. The General Assembly has condemned Russia's aggression. The International Court of Justice has ordered the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. The United Nations has placed Russian troops and their proxies on its list of shame for violations of children's rights. The Commission of Inquiry has confirmed that the transfer of Ukrainian children violated international humanitarian law. In response, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants. History offers a sobering precedent. In the 1990s, Europe and the whole world witnessed similar atrocities under Slobodan Milosevic, who pursued a chauvinistic, nationalistic, and bloody agenda, especially in Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. It is no coincidence that Russia vetoed a Security Council resolution condemning the Srebrenica genocide in 2015, and again opposed the 2024 General Assembly resolution designating the 11th of July as the International Day of Reflection and Commemoration of the Srebrenica genocide. Most recently, in the Security Council meeting in June this year, Russia even called for the closure of the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals and proposed facility modalities for war criminals convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity committed in former Yugoslavia. Genocide denial and the glorification of war criminals are universally condemned. They are an affront to justice and a threat to reconciliation. Mr. President, lasting peace in Ukraine cannot be built on silence or impunity. It must be built on justice and truth. Accountability must remain central if this war is to end. A just and durable peace must be anchored in international law and backed by strong international guarantees to ensure that such aggression is never repeated. We therefore reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders in full accordance with the UN Charter. Justice, truth, and accountability are not optional. They are the foundation of peace. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Albania. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
President, the question of Ukraine has now entered a critical phase of negotiated solution. The international community's calls for peace and dialogue are growing stronger. The key stakeholders have held a series of engagement activities and negotiations. China welcomes these developments and supports all efforts that lead to peace. We hope that the international community will seize the recent positive momentum to promote an early political settlement of the crisis. First, we must work together to facilitate negotiations. Dialogue and negotiation remain the only viable path out of the crisis. China calls on the parties to the conflict to maintain the momentum of dialogue, demonstrate political will, build consensus, and strive to reach a just, lasting, and binding peace agreement at an early date. The international community should facilitate a political settlement by fostering a positive atmosphere, creating favorable conditions, and providing necessary support. Second, it is imperative to jointly promote de-escalation. China urges all relevant parties to adhere to the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of hostilities, and no fanning the flame by any party in order to promote de-escalation and create conditions for political settlement. The parties to the conflict should prioritize humanitarian concerns and the well-being of civilians, exercise maximum restraint, and strictly observe international humanitarian law. No matter the circumstances, they must refrain from targeting civilians, refrain from using WMDs, or attacking nuclear power plants and other critical infrastructure. Third, we must contain the spillover effects. The ongoing crisis continues to impinge on global sustainable development. The earlier the fighting ends and unilateral sanctions are lifted, the sooner global supply chains can regain resilience, and the sooner the world economy can recover. China calls on the international community to strengthen cooperation on issues such as food, energy, finance, trade, and the protection of critical infrastructure in order to jointly maintain the stability and smooth functioning of global supply chains and safeguard the legitimate rights and development space of developing countries. Fourth, collective efforts are required to build a European security architecture. The Ukraine crisis is essentially a major eruption of tensions in Europe on the security front. Regarding future security guarantees for Ukraine, some ideas and proposals have been floated during recent interactions among various parties. China calls on all sides to embrace a vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. Bear in mind the principle of indivisible security, accommodate each other's legitimate concerns, and strive to find a security arrangement acceptable to all in order to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture and achieve lasting peace and stability in Europe. President, on the question of Ukraine, China upholds an objective, impartial, and consistent position, working tirelessly to promote a political solution through peaceful negotiation. From the very outset of the conflict, President Xi Jinping of China proposed the four shoulds, namely, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be fully observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries must be taken seriously, and all efforts that contribute to peaceful settlement of the crisis must be supported. These four principles are of even greater relevance under the current circumstances. Over the past 3 years, guided by the four shoulds, China has been working relentlessly to advocate peace and promote dialogue. We have never provided weapons to either party to the conflict and consistently maintained strict control over the export of dual-use items. We have maintained communication with both Russia and Ukraine as well as with other relevant parties. China's special envoys have engaged in shuttle diplomacy. Together with Brazil and other countries of the Global South, China initiated the Friends of Peace group in order to garner consensus and advocate peace efforts. China stands ready to working with the international community and playing a constructive role for the early political settlement of the crisis. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, we pay tribute to all those who lost their lives defending the freedom and independence of Ukraine, 3.5 years after the unjustified, unprovoked, full-scale invasion. Greece reiterates its full condemnation and expresses its solidarity and unwavering support for the Ukrainian people. We are appalled by the relentless attacks on major urban centers, civilians, and critical infrastructure, in blatant violation of international law. In fact, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, more than 14,000 civilians have lost their lives, with July 2025 being the deadliest month of the war. This has to end. We call upon Russia to immediately cease such unlawful actions and allow full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to the temporarily occupied territories. Moreover, we are gravely concerned over the persistent violations of human rights that Russia continues to commit in Ukraine, as verified by international monitoring mechanisms, including the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the UN Commission of Inquiry. The Secretary General's latest reports on children and armed conflict and conflict-related sexual violence are also revealing. We strongly condemn the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children, and we call for their immediate and safe return. We also condemn all acts of sexual and gender-based violence. Equally, there must be an exchange of all prisoners of war, and all persons unlawfully detained must be released. Greece supports a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in full conformity with international law, the United Nations Charter, and relevant UN resolutions, and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. In this regard, we welcome the US-led initiatives and the efforts of President Trump to put an end to the war. Any meaningful peace process should be focused on the following principles. First, no peace can be imposed upon Ukraine. Ukraine must be able to decide its own future. Second, any attempt to alter borders by the use of force is unacceptable and constitutes a dangerous precedent that undermines the very foundations of the international order. Third, a permanent peace agreement must rest on credible and enforceable security guarantees to prevent any recurrence of aggression in the future. The war in Ukraine is not just a regional conflict affecting European security, but a conflict with tangible risk for global stability, security, and peace. All partners around the globe could contribute to establishing a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. That will conform to all the rules-based global order and will effectively deter future acts of aggression elsewhere. Mr. President, Greece reiterates its unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine and the thousands of Ukrainians of Greek origin. We will continue to stand by them, and as we have done since the very beginning of the war. The time for peace and the reconstruction of Ukraine is here. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece. And now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Mr. President, Mexico reiterates its grave concern at the humanitarian, economic, food, and environmental consequences wrought by the war in Ukraine. Far from seeing a peace agreement emerge on the horizon, we are faced with the regrettable reality that violence continues. We condemn the recent mass missile and drone attacks waged against the city of Kyiv. These have claimed lives and caused grave damage to civilian infrastructure. All attacks against civilians or civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Moreover, they constitute a violation of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. In view of the fact that a diplomatic solution has yet to materialize, there is an urgent need to work to ensure the effective protection of the civilian population. All efforts must be focused on that goal, just as they must on ensuring the unfettered access of humanitarian aid and stringent respect for both international humanitarian law and refugee law. Mexico recognizes and deeply values the work of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as that done by humanitarian organizations working on the ground. We once again appeal for humanitarian personnel and humanitarian facilities and premises to be protected at all times. Mexico has spoken time and time again of the importance of particularly focusing on the implications of weapons transfers in this conflict. The growing volume of such arms transfers increases the likelihood of diversion of weapons, the indiscriminate use thereof, and the loss of control over them. More specifically, we condemn the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, and we roundly repudiate the use of cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines. Both forms of weapon are prohibited under international legal instruments. These aforementioned weapons have indiscriminate humanitarian effects, and their devastating consequences affect the civilian population even years after hostilities come to an end. The civilian population is the majority affected by these weapons. It is precisely at moments such as these in any conflict when we must strengthen compliance with, respect for, and the relevance of international standards. The Convention on Cluster Munition and the Convention on the Prohibition of Anti-Personnel Mines are fundamental pillars of international humanitarian law. We appeal to states that are not yet party to these conventions to accede to them without delay. And we urge those states that have recently repudiated any of these treaties to reconsider their position in line with humanitarian principles and that which guarantees the protection of human life. Elsewhere, attacks against nuclear facilities on Ukrainian territory have imperiled regional and global security and made both more vulnerable to a nuclear incident with grave consequences. The work of the International Atomic Energy Agency to continue to monitor Ukraine's nuclear power plants is worthy of great praise. We are convinced that any peace agreement must be firmly rooted in the United Nations Charter, in respect for the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. As such, we support the Secretary General's willingness to offer up his good offices and UN instruments to achieve an immediate, comprehensive, and unconditional ceasefire. We also value the various proposals for peace issued by countries seeking peace negotiations. Mexico is of the view that the United Nations must play an active role and serve as the guarantor of any peace agreement reached. Mr. President, let us halt the death and the violence that have devastated Ukraine, and bearing in mind the reality on the ground, let us move towards a negotiated solution. In this spirit, Mexico is an active member of the Group of Friends for Peace in Ukraine. We are convinced that it is only through diplomacy, candid dialogue, and a commitment to the peaceful settlement of disputes that we will be able to achieve a negotiated solution, one which will restore peace and allow us to put an end to this horrific war. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome holding this important debate on Russia's ongoing war of aggression and continued occupation of Ukraine territories. Lithuania aligns itself with the statements by the European Union and the Nordic and Baltic states delivered by Sweden. I also will make a statement in my national capacity. Today, almost 1/5 of Ukraine's territory remains occupied by Russia, forcing millions of Ukrainian people to flee from their homes. More than 3.5 million Ukrainians are internally displaced, millions more struggling with severe deprivation, and over 5.5 million have sought refuge abroad, including tens of thousands in Lithuania. To better support refugees from the occupied areas of Ukraine, Lithuania has been working closely with the UN Regional Refugee Response Plan that brings together national governments, UN, and NGOs in assistance to the refugees. In this regard, I would like to express our heartfelt appreciation to UN and other international humanitarian efforts and all humanitarian workers, particularly the UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine, Assistant Secretary General Matthias Schmale, and his team for working in the field. Mr. President, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine have concluded that Russian armed forces have committed the crimes against humanity, murder, and the war crimes of attacking civilians. It is also found that these acts were committed with the primary purpose to spread terror among the civilian population in violation of international humanitarian law. This is all the result of Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine that started in February and March 2014 with the occupation and attempted annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and that entered the phase of the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. Mr. President, people in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, as well as prisoners of war, civilian detainees, and deported Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus must remain at the center of international attention. They must be at the heart of every effort to achieve a just, comprehensive, and long-term peace for Ukraine. It's about the destiny of the Ukrainian people, not less than about the Ukrainian territory. We must continue to demand that Russia provide all available data on forcibly transferred and/or unlawfully deported Ukrainian children, civilian detainees, and prisoners of war, and access to places in Russia and temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories where they are held. Russia must be held fully accountable for the crimes of aggression and for the war crimes committed. Perpetrators must face justice, including throughout a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. There can be no lasting peace without accountability. Defending Ukraine means defending peace, justice, and international law, the very principles on which the United Nations was founded. Mr. President, to put an end to the suffering caused by Russia's war aggression, we must all increase comprehensive support to Ukraine, including by stepping up our military assistance, enhancing humanitarian efforts, and contributing to Ukraine's recovery. Lithuania calls on the international community to exert all available pressure on Russia to agree to an immediate, unconditional, and verifiable ceasefire as the first step prior to any meaningful negotiations, paving the way towards just and lasting peace, firmly rooted in Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, in full compliance with the international law, including the UN Charter. Just and lasting peace in Ukraine and long-term security for Ukraine and Europe can only be achieved when Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is put to an end. Ukraine has full right to defend itself, and we will continue standing with Ukraine until its victory and beyond. Lithuania expresses its unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in full compliance with the UN Charter and its principles. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lithuania. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro.
Mr. President, distinguished Deputy Foreign Minister, we welcome today's discussion on Ukraine. It is essential that the General Assembly remain fully apprised of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Dear colleagues, allow me to recall that Ukraine has recently marked 34th anniversary of its independence. Montenegro recognizes the tremendous courage displayed by Ukraine and its people in defense of their country against Russia. This serves as a stark reminder that no independence can be taken for granted. Montenegro once again strongly condemns Russia's continued violation of the UN Charter and its disregard for the UN General Assembly's resolutions. We call upon the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law, including the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. Those responsible for war crimes and other serious violations, including government officials and military representatives, must be held accountable. Montenegro remains gravely concerned about the continuing risks to nuclear safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Russia's persistent attacks on civilian infrastructure jeopardize the ability of Ukraine's electricity grid to provide reliable off-site power supply to its nuclear facilities. It is imperative that attacks against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure stop immediately. The humanitarian consequences of the Russian aggression for millions of civilians remain catastrophic. Mr. President, Montenegro reaffirms its commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We will continue to provide military, financial, humanitarian, and other forms of assistance to Ukraine, including through relevant EU and international mechanisms. Montenegro commends and supports diplomatic efforts led by the US aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter and international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Montenegro. We now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Mr. President, thank you very much for convening today's meeting on this important topic. Singapore has taken a clear and consistent position that Russia's invasion of Ukraine constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter. A world order based on might is right would be profoundly inimical to the security and survival of small states. We do not and cannot accept one country attacking another under the pretext of historical errors and omissions. For a small state like Singapore, this is a matter of fundamental principle and existential importance. Mr. President, Singapore has no interest in taking sides. Our position is firmly grounded in the belief that the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of all countries, big or small, must be respected. Singapore supports a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law, international humanitarian law, and relevant UN resolutions. We reiterate our call for all parties involved in this conflict to adhere to their obligations under the UN Charter and international law, and to negotiate in good faith and step up efforts towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with a statement to be delivered by the European Union and would like to make the following remarks in its national capacity. 11 years since its forced annexation, the Russian Federation continues to assert its illegitimate occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol in violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. At the height of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Russia held disputed referenda in the temporary occupied regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, further worsening the human rights situation in these territories. We reiterate our full solidarity with Ukraine, and we strongly condemn Moscow's actions, which mark a stark violation of the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of states, as enshrined within the UN Charter. We reaffirm our commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and reaffirm our non-recognition of the Russian Federation's attempted annexation. We further condemn Russian attempts to alter Ukraine's national identity and way of life by imposing Russian citizenship through military suppression and intimidation, which in effect alters the demographic structures of Ukraine's Russian-occupied territories. As we speak, Russian authorities inside the occupied regions of Ukraine continue to impose bans upon Ukrainian language, traditions, and holidays, ultimately paving the way towards a militarized Russification policy that erases the voice of the Ukrainian people in these areas. Ultimately, Malta calls on Russia to immediately reverse its forced and illegitimate occupation of these Ukrainian regions without any further delay. Mr. President, it is with regret that Malta notes the unlawful deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children from Russian-occupied territories inside Ukraine by Russia, deliberately resulting in forced changes to the identity and citizenship of Ukrainian children. As chair in office of the OSCE during 2024, and as part of its ongoing presidency of the Council of Europe, Malta has placed specific attention on children impacted by Russia's aggression against Ukraine and continues to advocate for the return of forcibly displaced Ukrainian children. In this vein, we urge the Russian authorities to implement the immediate and unconditional return of all unlawfully deported, as well as forcibly transferred Ukrainian children and adults. To conclude, we emphasize that peace in Ukraine will only last if it is rooted in international law and the UN Charter. Malta will continue to support efforts, including those of the United States, to stop the bloodshed and reduce civilian suffering, as we reiterate our commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and prosperity. The aggression must stop. A complete and unconditional ceasefire is most urgently needed to prevent additional tragedies from occurring. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Mr. President, this organization resolved 80 years ago that all its members should refrain from the use of force against territorial integrity of other states. However, for more than a decade, we have been witnessing an unfolding of a blatant violation of the Charter's core principles. Starting in 2014, with Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and continuing in 2022 with Russia's large-scale military aggression against Ukraine. For more than a decade, we have been watching how the core principles of international relations are being trampled in front of our eyes. Moreover, the citizens of occupied territories continue to suffer extensive violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law committed by the Russian Federation. Slovenia condemns the acts of torture, summary executions, sexual-based violence, and abduction of Ukrainian children. Some of these amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ukrainian citizens have the right to enjoy peace, dignity, and freedom. But there cannot be a just and lasting peace without respect for international law, including the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Changing internationally recognized borders by force is unacceptable. Mr. President, Slovenia has advocated for a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter since the very start of the war. We hear both sides commit to peace. What we see on the ground, however, is Russia's intensification of attacks across Ukraine, targeting civilians, residential buildings, schools, and hospitals. What we see are new records in the scale of overnight aerial attacks in urban areas and higher numbers of civilian casualties. What we are deeply concerned to see is that the war in Ukraine is becoming even deadlier than when it has started. Slovenia condemns the escalation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. The daily attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure represent a blatant violation of international humanitarian law and must not go unpunished. What is more, these actions are undermining the ongoing peace efforts. Mr. President, swarming densely populated urban areas with missiles and drones while listing ultimatums does not amount to peace talks. Ukraine has shown its commitment to engage in peace negotiations, accepting the proposal for a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. We need to see real commitment from Russia as well. The bloodshed needs to stop. We need a leaders' summit. We need a ceasefire, and we need it now. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia. We now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, we take the floor today with a heavy heart and a clear conscience. For more than 3.5 years, Ukraine has endured an unprovoked and illegal war of aggression by the Russian Federation, a war that violates the fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. This war continues to take innocent lives, devastate infrastructure, and uproot families, with women and children paying the highest price. As of today, large parts of Ukraine remain under temporary occupation, transformed into zones of repression and fear. In this assembly, we must call things by their names. The deportation of Ukrainian children, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the use of sexual violence, and the repression in occupied territories, these are not acts of war, these are war crimes. Mr. President, the courage and resilience of Ukrainian people inspire us all. Their defense is not only of their freedom and land, but also of European peace, democracy, and the global order based on rules. We deeply admire their determination, their strength, and their sacrifice. Ukraine does not stand alone. We stand in unwavering solidarity with Ukraine. We strongly support its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and the regions temporarily under occupation. The Republic of Moldova is proud to be a friend and a partner. Since the outbreak of war, more than 1.8 million Ukrainians refugees crossed the Moldovan border. Now, my country hosts around 133,000 people offering shelter, care, and support. We have facilitated the transit of Ukrainian grain, supported the energy infrastructure, and trained over 160 Ukrainian demining specialists. These actions are modest in scale, perhaps, but firm in conviction. Where our resources may be limited, our voice is strong. Excellencies, the Republic of Moldova joins international partners in calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as a necessary first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Such a peace must be grounded in the UN Charter and international law, nothing less. Ceasefire cannot mean freezing the conflict. It must open the way to a full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and accountability for the crimes committed. Moreover, Ukraine must receive strong security guarantees to ensure a concrete and legally binding mechanism to prevent future Russian aggression. Mr. President, Russia's aggression does not end at Ukrainian borders. Moldova too has been facing all forms of hybrid warfare, propaganda, economic blackmail, cyber attacks, election interference, all aiming to destabilize our institutions and derail the European course. We know what is at stake. That is why we continue to contribute to regional security and share our experience to counter hybrid threats. Moldova supports the establishment of a Center for Countering Hybrid Threats in Odessa. Resilience, economic, civic, and democratic is our shared defense. Let us not forget, this war is not only about Ukraine's borders. It is about all our borders, about whether force can redraw the map of Europe, about whether fear can replace freedom. The Republic of Moldova believes in peace, but peace cannot come at the price of justice, nor at the expense of the victims. We must rise to this moment, just as the generations before us did when peace was threatened on the European continent. Let us not be the generation that hesitated. Let us be the generation that stood firm, that defended our values, and that helped restore peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today we gather here for this GA plenary following nearly 1,300 of an ongoing war of aggression waged by a permanent member of the UN Security Council against a sovereign state. As indiscriminate attacks against the civilians and civilian infrastructure further escalate, this clear violation of the principles of the UN Charter continues to bring tremendous suffering to innocent people. Mr. President, my delegation would like to once again underscore what we all agree is the most urgent task before us: the cessation of hostilities, namely a swift end to this conflict, as expressed in Security Council Resolution 2774, adopted in February this year. As we approach the fourth winter of this war, it is high time to catalyze our wisdom and determinations to realize this imperative as quickly as possible. In this light, the Republic of Korea supports timely diplomatic efforts to halt the bloodshed and end this war without further delay. We express our deep appreciation for the leadership and sustained efforts of the United States in galvanizing the international community toward a peaceful resolution. We fully support further decisive steps in these directions to save lives and restore peace. However, it is deeply regrettable that Russia continues to ignore and refuse to respond to the unified voices
of the international community, including the United States. On the contrary, the shocking reality on the ground continues to worsen as increasingly large-scale, nightly drone and missile barrage stalk Ukrainian families in their sleep across the country. My delegation takes this opportunity to reiterate our condemnation of such escalating attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, such as those on July 31st and August 28th that killed dozens and injured hundreds of Ukrainian civilians, including many children. These attacks constitute blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Civilians must always be protected and should never be targeted. Mr. President, one of the key factors that obstructs a swift end to this war and, in fact, serves to prolong it is the ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK, despite repeated and unequivocal condemnations from the international community. This collaboration constitutes a blatant violation of the UN Charter and relevant Security Council resolutions, directly threatening the security of the Republic of Korea and seriously destabilizing regional security in both Europe and Asia. It must stop immediately. Mr. President, as this senseless war has continued for nearly 1,300 days now, my government strongly supports diplomatic efforts and negotiations to end the war, forge peace, and restore human dignity to Ukraine. For its part, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its commitment to ending this war while standing alongside the Ukrainian people as they rebuild their country and work toward a peaceful and secure future. In particular, as President of the Security Council for the month of September, the Republic of Korea will play a constructive role in achieving this goal. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Excellency, Madam Minister, distinguished colleagues. For 3.5 years now, Ukraine and Ukrainians are resisting their neighbors' aggression. They're doing so with a courage that compels us to act. For 3.5 years, Russia, day in, day out, has chosen to continue this war and to intensify it, and this at a cost of a growing number of victims. For 3.5 years now, Russia has been indiscriminately hitting civilian targets and critical infrastructure in Ukraine in violation of international humanitarian law. For 3.5 years, reports drafted by the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry have been alerting us to war crimes, crimes against humanity, executions, torture, rape, the kidnapping and deportation of children, all of them committed in Ukraine by Russia. For over a decade, thousands of Ukrainians have been living under occupation. This in illegally annexed Ukrainian territories, illegally annexed by Russia. I'd like to recall the decisions adopted by this Assembly. On the 12th of October 2022, the UN General Assembly condemned the attempt at illegal annexation waged by Russia, annexation of the Ukrainian regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. In 2014, the UN General Assembly condemned the sham referenda organized by Russia in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. The Assembly also deemed that these unilateral decisions were not valid and that they could not serve as the basis for any modifications to the status of Crimea, a serious and unacceptable violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the UN Charter. A large majority of Assembly members have been calling for peace. They've been doing this since the very start of the aggression. On 8 occasions since the 24th of February 2022, the General Assembly expressed its commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In February of last year, 2 General Assembly resolutions once again called for just and lasting peace in keeping with the principles of sovereign equality and the territorial integrity of states. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, Ukraine has been very clear about its desire to negotiate peace. Already 6 months ago, Ukraine stated that it's willing to introduce an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine accepted, in principle, a bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin, proposed within the framework of a diplomatic initiative put forward by President Trump. As for Russia, it continues to engage in dilatory maneuvering, its sole objective being not to seek peace, but to continue its armed aggression in Ukraine. Russia is setting maximalist conditions. It's claiming to need time to prepare the meeting, but this time Russia is using it to strike at Ukrainians, to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, and to try and dent Ukraine's resistance through terror. Today, just as all the time since the 24th of February 2022, Russia is choosing war. France condemns in the strongest possible terms Russian attacks which struck Ukraine over the last few days, killing dozens of civilians, including children. France will continue providing Ukraine with the support it needs to command respect for its independence, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity. We will continue to stand side by side with Ukraine and its partners, working towards peace in keeping with international law, with due respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. This just, robust, and lasting peace is something that the UN General Assembly has called on multiple occasions. And this peace will involve robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine, which is what France and Europeans, alongside the US, are committed to, so that Ukraine and Ukrainians at last have the possibility to choose their future. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Mr. President, it has been 3.5 years since Russia launched its unprovoked war of aggression against the sovereign state of Ukraine. During this period, countless innocent civilians of Ukraine have lost their lives, while many more have been injured as a result of Russia's ruthless and indiscriminate attacks on critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and power plants. This war has further evolved, with North Korea supplying Russia with weapons, ammunition, and ballistic missiles, and even deploying its own troops in support. Such unlawful, illegitimate, and unacceptable military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, being carried out in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions, expands the geographical scope of the conflict and undermines peace and security in Europe, in the Pacific, and beyond. Mr. President, Russia's aggression against Ukraine constitutes a clear and blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. The Charter represents a solemn commitment that all member states must observe in good faith, and it remains an unshakable foundation of international relations. The preservation of sovereignty and territorial integrity is of paramount importance, and any unilateral change of the status quo by force is never acceptable, anywhere in the world. Any action that directly or indirectly supports Russia's aggression is itself a violation of international law, and all states complicit in such aggression must be held accountable. Japan also strongly condemns the widespread and systematic use of torture, including sexual violence as a form of torture, carried out against both Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, and committed openly with an apparent sense of impunity by Russian authorities. Any war crimes and violations of human rights must be met with accountability. Mr. President, despite tireless diplomatic efforts by many countries, Russia continues its attacks across Ukraine. Japan strongly demands that Russia move toward a swift and comprehensive ceasefire and ultimately toward the realization of a just and lasting peace. Japan welcomes the active efforts of the United States and European partners in striving to end Russia's aggression and to achieve such a peace. In this regard, it is essential to emphasize the issues concerning the sovereignty and territorial integrity must be addressed with the involvement of Ukraine. Japan also believes the war has shown the security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. Achieving peace in Ukraine requires a considerable global security implications, and establishing a framework to deter renewed aggression and illegitimate use of force. Mr. President, Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction is an urgent task for the international community. As a step toward recovery, Japan will host the Ukraine Mine Action Conference in Tokyo on 22nd and 23rd October 2025, bringing together public and private expertise to advance mine clearance. Japan will continue to actively support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction while building international momentum. Mr. President, we must not stop our efforts to maintain and strengthen the international order based on the rule of law and realize a safe and secure world where human dignity is protected. Japan's position remains unwavering. We have stood with Ukraine and we will continue to stand with Ukraine. Japan will continue to work in close partnership with its allies and partners in pursuit of a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, Minister, Excellencies, Belgium fully supports the statement to be made by the delegation of the European Union. We take this opportunity to emphasize the following points therein. Mr. President, nothing can justify Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It was embarked upon over 10 years ago and was continued on a large scale, has been continued on a large scale indeed since the 24th of February 2022. This aggression has already caused immeasurable suffering. It persistently violates the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Our reaction must be commensurate with the gravity of these violations. As such, we endorse the repeated appeal made for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. The first step towards that peace is a comprehensive, immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The Secretary General once again called for such a ceasefire on the 28th of August. Ukraine is ready to accept just that. Russia's attempts to annex ever more Ukrainian territory must cease, as must the countless abuses that this attempt gives rise to. No doubt can distract us from that fact. Dear colleagues, there is no situation in which deadly strikes against innocent civilians, children, prepare the ground for the peace we need to see. Russia, the aggressor, seems to once again have chosen violence and cynicism over diplomacy. In so doing, Russia last week, during a large-scale strike, damaged the diplomatic representation of the European Union and the British Council in Kyiv. That was one more violation of the 1961 Vienna Convention that was added to Russia's deadly record. Dear colleagues, recent reports published by various UN agencies detail the countless violations of human rights or of international humanitarian law perpetrated in the areas illegally occupied by Russia. These reports document arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, cases of torture, and systematic oppression. The humanitarian situation in these areas is of increasingly grave concern. At the same time, Russia is hindering the access of humanitarian personnel and personnel from the Human Rights Office. The 2025 report on children and armed conflict provided concerning evidence of a sharp increase in grave violations perpetrated against Ukrainian children and children in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian areas. Violations, that is, perpetrated by Russian forces and affiliated arms groups. More than 1 million children in the temporarily occupied territories, what's more, are facing protection risks and are at risk of having their rights violated. The occupying power has restricted these children's access to teaching in the Ukrainian language. Yet again, according to these reports, Russia has threatened or sanctioned children and their parents for having spoken Ukrainian. A lasting peace will also involve inevitably accountability and compliance with the law. The perpetrators of the most serious crimes under international law that are shown to have been committed on Ukrainian territory must be held responsible for their actions. Justice must be done and future crimes must be deterred. Belgium calls upon this assembly and its members to not leave any violation of the United Nations Charter unnoticed and to not allow any violation to go unpunished. The necessary accountability mechanisms must be seized. This war of choice and of temporary occupation that results from that war of choice must cease. The Russian aggression and the selective interpretation by Russia of sovereignty of certain member states of our organization threaten international peace and security. This state of affairs must compel us to collectively reaffirm our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. This state of affairs must also compel us to act to protect the above. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. The Kingdom of the Netherlands fully aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. And I want to begin with the story of Olia, a young woman from the city of Donetsk, who lived in by Russia occupied territory for almost 10 years now. We spoke with her recently at the occasion of Ukraine's Independence Day. Simply identifying as Ukrainian or speaking about her country put her life at risk. She was confronted with constant violence and intimidation by the Russian occupiers, wide-ranging restrictions on education and culture, and a threat of forced deportation. Olia eventually fled the occupied territories, and this is why we know her story. Her courage reminds us of the human face behind the statistics. The broader situation mirrors Olia's experience. We must not stay silent about the fact that Russia systematically tries to destroy Ukrainian identity in the roughly 20% of Ukraine it still occupies. and that Russia in this act is committing a long list of human rights abuses. These atrocities are originating from the same approach, using terror and destruction, as we see with the daily Russian air raids on Ukrainian cities. In the occupied territories, reports detail arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, torture, and the forced deportation of children. Cultural suppression is pervasive. Ukrainian language education is curtailed, traditional holidays are banned, and citizens are pressured to adopt Russian citizenship to access basic services. These actions represent clear abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. International bodies have documented these abuses in detail. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has collected extensive evidence of crimes against humanity, including torture and enforced disappearances. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission continues to report on these violations, emphasizing the urgent need for accountability. The Kingdom of the Netherlands urges the Russian Federation once more to withdraw from the Ukrainian areas it temporarily occupies, starting by immediately stop its appalling attempt to erase people's identity there. The rights and dignity of the civilians living in the occupied territories must be protected. And, of course, eventually, accountability for atrocities committed in the occupied territories should be ensured, as well as compensation for the damage. We reiterate our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Russia's aggression should not be rewarded, since it will only lead to further aggression by Russia and potentially by others. If territorial integrity can be violated without consequences, this would open Pandora's box. The story of Olia and countless others underscores the importance of sustained international support, ensuring that justice is pursued and the rights and dignity of Ukraine's citizens in all regions of the country are restored. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
you.